The island of Tromelin is this. The Isle of Sand was its former name because it really is as desolate as it appears. In 1761, this location was left desolate, with about 100 individuals who had been kidnapped from their own nation. The majority of them were never heard from again. Jean de Lafarge was seen switching between two maps just after sunset on July 31st, 1761. He was in a rush as captain of the French ship L'Utile, but it didn't help. He had two contradictory charts of the same area of the Indian Ocean. After setting sail from Madagascar's eastern coast, Captain Jean faced gusts of up to 20 knots while navigating his ship in total darkness. The fact that his ship was veering off course was obvious to him, even without a map or good eyesight, just a few feet ahead. However, he had to rely on inaccurate information because the ship did not have a good map. Given this, it would have been prudent for him to ease off until dawn to get his bearings, but Captain Jean had no such luxury. From what is now Mauritius, the Isle of France, Captain Jean and his crew of about 140 men were ordered to sail westward to Madagascar with a cargo of rice and cattle. Only Captain Jean and his crew were aware of the ship's additional stay before it was due to return to the Isle of France, which was expected in a few days. Captain Jean couldn't turn down the chance to earn significantly more money, even though the payment for the meat and rice would be a decent sum. Going around the Isle of France and onto Rodriguez Island was his intention. His mission was to return to the Isle of France with provisions, but first he would unload some unexpected cargo. As Captain Jean touched down on Rodriguez Island, the cargo hold was shackled with 160 individuals, including men, women, and children, who were of Malagasy heritage or locals of Madagascar. They were there to be sold. From the moment the Malagasy were coerced into the ship, he was eager to reach the island since the paycheck he was expected to receive for them exceeded the value of meat and rice. Since the governor of the Isle of France had banned such pursuits in 1761, they were selling for a premium by that year. It was a very illegal journey, but it was also quite profitable. In the end, Captain Jean's choice was influenced by all these things. The crew was busy carrying out his orders to keep the ship going as scheduled while he attempted to determine its whereabouts. He didn't think it was an option to wait for daylight. Nevertheless, if he had shown a modicum of patience and held out until dawn, he would have been privy to the presence of the little island right in front of the ship. Actually, the reef that encircled the island, just beneath the water's surface, was more likely to raise concerns than the island itself. When the ship ran aground on the reef in the middle of the Indian Ocean's turbulent waters, Captain Jean saw firsthand how protected the island was. This was an instant disaster for the ship. Water quickly flooded the vessel once the hull was broken open. Even though Captain Jean and the majority of his crew escaped to the island for safety, a storm carried 18 of the men out to sea, where they perished. Many Malagasy and the goods were swept away by the rapid water, which was a terrible thing. Those fortunate enough to be able to escape successfully used the opening that the reef had formed. Shortly after the damage was done, the ship sank with about half of the Malagasy still trapped in the cargo hold. After losing their ship in the night, they were able to realize the severity of their situation when the light came up. After the crash, about 120 crew members and 60 to 80 Malagasy were able to safely disembark. Regrettably, they found themselves marooned on an island that was formerly called the Isle of Sand. As dawn broke, the survivors must have had an overwhelming feeling of fear, as they could now see clearly where they were. Being stranded on the Isle of Sand is practically the worst possible situation. Smack dab in the center of the Indian Ocean, this island was first spotted by the French in the 1720s. It is around 300 miles northwest of Réunion Island and 280 miles east of Madagascar. The island used to be a volcano, but it has been gradually destroyed over millions of years, if not longer, by rising sea levels. Furthermore, the island's landmass is just under 1 square kilometer. Envision an island around the size of a typical city block. Yet there's more. There was no way to see distant ships from its peak, which stands just 23 feet, 7 meters above sea level. That wouldn't be an issue on a tree island, but the Isle of Sand lived up to its name. Actually, there was no vegetation on the island whatsoever, save for a few short blades of grass and a few low-lying plants. Animals were also in short supply due to the low vegetation cover. The adjacent reefs did have fish, but fishing there would be a challenge due to the reefs themselves. The food supply was very lacking, with seabirds landing on the island and turtles washing up on the coast being the only readily available options. Additionally, the island's warm tropical temperature is a result of its proximity to the equator. Most of the year, the island's temperatures are anything but warm, due to the lack of trees and shade. The only months when the average temperature drops below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius, are July and August. The remainder of the year is scorching hot, with relentless sunshine. The absence of shelter and the island's massive size make even the sunniest days feel like a windstorm. In addition, violent tropical storms and cyclones are a common summertime occurrence, bringing heavy rainfall. Considering the island lacks a fresh water supply, this is obviously crucial for anybody intending to spend any amount of time there. As soon as Captain Jean and the other survivors landed on the island, his conduct became more and more unpredictable. He was already under a great deal of stress from the Malagasy smuggling and being lost in the Indian Ocean. Now he had to worry about losing even more money and being unable to hide the fact that he was engaging in extremely illegal activity. Captain Jean would have to confront the governor of the Isle of France if and when he was freed from the island, a highly improbable event. He appeared to take a vacation from reality when the tension grew intolerable. His life took a dramatic turn after that. He was never the same. After this setback, his subordinates had no option but to remove him from leadership. The responsibility for coordinating the survival attempts was thereafter passed on to First Lieutenant Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet. Immediately following the stranding, some of the crew began collecting items that had fallen to the island from the ship, while others dove into the wreck to salvage what supplies were still within. This allowed them to gather a good supply of food, wood, and other things that might be useful in an emergency. Nevertheless, obtaining potable fresh water, which ought to have been the first concern, was totally disregarded. There was no incentive to address it at the outset of their adventure because the crew controlled all the food and water, and the Malagasy were not seen as equals. 8 Malagasy would perish within a few days due to dehydration. The new commander did not order the drilling of a well to locate water until after their deaths. Even though they were in a similar situation, the social gap between the two communities persisted. They worked together and shared survival necessities, like building an oven and a forge, but the Malagasy didn't get much of the food or water that was stored. The crew went so far as to establish a tent on the opposite side of the island, isolating themselves physically from the Malagasy. When Barthélemy had a ship constructed from the remains of Lutil, the disparities between them were quite clear. Rather than only instructing the construction of a raft using the salvaged timber, the order was to construct a whole ship from the ground up. They even christened the newly constructed ship the Providence after it was finished. After over 2 months of being stranded, the Providence was finally loaded and left the Isle of Sand on September 27th. At that point, it departed, abandoning the last remaining Malagasy survivors and promising to return with a rescue ship. Returning to Madagascar, the Providence had spent 4 days at sea. However, a sickness that permeated the ship throughout the voyage ultimately claimed the lives of several crew members, including Captain Jean. Consequently, upon the crew's return to France, the governor of the Isle of France demanded an explanation from Barthélemy, who was held responsible for all that had transpired. Despite the governor's wrath and Barthélemy's scolding, the latter persisted in attempting to persuade the former to dispatch a ship to the Isle of Sand. Regrettably, Barthélemy was repeatedly turned down by the governor. Not a single ship was spared during the 7 Years' War, which France and Britain were waging for global domination at the time. Because of this, the Malagasy could expect no aid. The 60 or so Malagasy anxiously awaited a rescue ship in the months following the Providence's departure from the island, but little did they realize that it would never arrive. Because of the lack of alternatives, the surviving population eventually settled down on the hostile island. Malagasy people made do with digging holes in the sand and filling them with coral pebbles for protection, as the island lacked many useful natural resources. The Malagasy would often bury their deceased in structures similar to mausoleums found in modern cemeteries. From the base of the trenches up to a few feet above ground, they would construct walls. A stone roof was subsequently placed on top of the construction, completing the small underground edifice that was meant to shelter the deceased for all time. Because of this, the castaways from Madagascar effectively made their homes in what they perceived as tombs. Worse yet, none of the surviving individuals belonged to the coastal regions of Madagascar. They were all natives of the Middle Highlands, The drastically reduced resources they had to work with made it that much more challenging for them to adapt to life by the water, and the unique challenges of fishing and hunting compared to their inland counterparts. Furthermore, turtles, one of their few available food sources, were prohibited to consume in Madagascar. However, concerns about consuming them were quickly dispelled as the pangs of hunger set in, and they started to go hungry. If there was any silver lining to their ordeal, it would be that they weren't limited to a diet consisting only of turtles or fish. Although the Malagasy may have mastered fishing while on the island, seabirds provided the bulk of their diet due to their abundance. Despite the early attention to food, water, and shelter, as well as the necessary adaptations by the Malagasy, their numbers, unfortunately, began to decline. People started dying, and it's unclear if it was from disease or starvation. Not long after the sailors departed the island, the Malagasy fashioned a large raft from the remaining wood. Upon completion, 18 of them got on board and paddled away from the island, seeking assistance from somewhere else to rescue their fellow survivors. Unfortunately, none of these 18 were ever seen again. Hope started to dwindle as the months they were stuck on the little desert island grew into years. Only 15 out of 60 Malagasy were still alive after 3 years. Although Barthélemy returned to France a year after the Providence touched down in Madagascar, he commendably persisted in requesting that authorities dispatch a rescue mission for the Malagasy. Although Barthélemy extended his plea beyond the governor with each letter he wrote, the governor remained steadfast in his refusal. He reached out to anyone politically influential who might approve a rescue mission on their behalf. The Minister of Marine Affairs of the Isle of France finally snapped at him for being overly persistent. However, in 1772, 11 years after the sinking of L'Utile, Barthélemy achieved victory when the war had ended. In order to save the Malagasy, the Minister of Marine Affairs finally consented to dispatch a ship. It took another 3 years before a single ship sailed from the harbor for the Isle of Sand, because even this was painfully slow. Not even a sighting reported by a passing ship in 1773, nor Barthélemy's involvement of the French media could hasten the rescue. Finally, in 1775, the first ship dispatched to the Isle of Sand reached the outer edge of the protective reef, only to turn back. It was a disappointing yet necessary step. After that, another 12 months passed before they tried again. The ship in question veered off course, approached the island as near as the reef would allow, and then set anchor. As a pair, 2 sailors embarked on a row toward the island when their crewmates lowered a rowboat into the ocean. As if the impending storm hadn't already made it clear how dangerous the reef was, the rowboat was hurled into it by the Whitecaps just as it set sail, shattering into pieces and sending both men plunging into the water. As one of them made his way back to the ship, the other swam toward shore. He then watched in horror as his ship raised its anchor and left him behind, alone. The shipwrecked crewmen soon became an integral part of Malagasy society and oversaw the construction of another raft. The only distinction between this raft and the one built over 10 years ago was the use of seabird feathers for the sail. Once the sailor finished with the vessel, 6 Malagasy people boarded, and the raft drifted off into the Indian Ocean. However, like the previous attempt, the raft and its passengers vanished without a trace. With the raft's departure, the remaining Malagasy returned to their isolation, praying that rescue would come soon. But as the months passed, it became increasingly clear that no one was coming. You can only imagine how painful each failed rescue effort must have been. At some point, they must have even grown used to the fact that every attempt ended in failure. They likely came to terms with the reality that they would never leave the Isle of Sand, and carried on with the life they had built after the French crew abandoned them. On the other hand, November 29, 1776, would prove to be a turning point. That day, a tiny French vessel, Dauphin, commanded by Captain Jacques-Marie Boudin de Tromelin, arrived at the island. What he and his crew discovered was truly astonishing. Among the 60 to 80 Malagasy who had originally survived the catastrophe, only 7 women remained. One of them, a mother, had given birth on the island to a baby boy, who was now 8 months old. The others wore garments fashioned from braided seabird feathers. Upon surveying the Malagasy's living conditions, Captain Jacques was astounded. The settlement featured a cluster of modest structures and a food storage shed built from coral stones. In addition, the Malagasy had successfully built a small watchtower to monitor passing ships. Despite the ingenuity they had shown in adapting to their harsh environment, they were overwhelmed with relief that their suffering had finally come to an end. For 15 years, the Malagasy had known nothing but life on the Isle of Sand. That changed when Captain Jacques escorted the 7 women and the infant boy aboard Dauphin, and the ship sailed away, leaving the desolate island behind. They were taken to the Isle of France, where the newly appointed compassionate governor welcomed them with open arms. He quickly declared them free and arranged for their transportation back to Madagascar. However, the women flat out refused to return. The exact reason behind their refusal remains unknown. Some speculate that they feared another shipwreck. Regardless, the governor granted them citizenship on the Isle of France instead. As for the baby boy, his mother and grandmother were taken in by the governor himself, who welcomed them into his own estate. To further integrate them into his family, he rechristened and baptized them all. History simply stopped paying attention to them once they arrived on the Isle of France. The Isle of Sand was rechristened Tromelin Island in honor of Captain Jacques' valiant efforts in rescuing the Malagasy. That name has remained in use ever since. To this day, the small sandy island remains in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but its tragic past has transformed it into a significant archaeological site, a place where history whispers its long-forgotten secrets. Since 2006, 4 archaeological missions have been conducted, all in an effort to understand how the Malagasy people managed to survive for 15 years in such a harsh and unforgiving environment. By the time the first expedition recorded and studied the wreckage, little remained. The only artifacts left were those too heavy to be raised to the surface: anchors, cannons, ammunition, and the ship's rigging. Beyond that, the Malagasy had used everything else. The next mission set out with one primary goal: to uncover artifacts, and, if possible, the remains of those who had perished. As excavations progressed, archaeologists uncovered 3 structures, including what was likely a kitchen. Within it, they found a stack of copper bowls, salvaged from the wreck and carefully preserved. Nearby, they unearthed an oven, constructed during the earliest days of the survivors' stranding. Despite lacking proper tools, bolts, or loose copper sheets, the Malagasy had found a way to repair the damaged bowls. Instead of bolting patches over the holes, they melted down scraps of copper from the ship, reshaped them, and riveted them onto the bowls using a mix of metal instruments, including bone. Further discoveries included an iron tripod for cooking, handmade spoons, and a large lead bowl, raising the possibility that the survivors may have suffered from lead exposure over time. But beyond the necessities of survival, the excavation revealed something else, something deeply human. Archaeologists uncovered copper jewelry, rings, necklaces, and bracelets, along with a copper comb, likely used for detangling hair. At first glance, these may seem like insignificant details, but in reality, they prove that the Malagasy did more than just survive. They built a society. Against all odds, they adapted, endured, and created in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Today, little remains of their 15-year struggle on Tromelin Island. Each survivor was interviewed multiple times after their rescue. Yet, strangely, no documentation of their personal accounts has ever been found. Their voices, their stories, their emotions, lost to history. But their legacy, it remains, a testament to the unbreakable will of the human spirit.